All right, well, good morning to all of you. Let us start with a word of prayer. Father, we pray for your blessing on our time this morning. Move in our, not just our minds, but in our hearts as we think about you and our society. In your name we pray. Amen. I am an absent-minded professor, and what that means this morning is that we don't have a PowerPoint, even though I made one, and I brought my little device. The problem was, I realized right before I left, I saved it to my computer, but not to this. And then I got this. This happens when I'm teaching all the time, but my classroom is close enough to my office I can run back and fix things. But anyway, images. What do you need them for? Concluding this little series on civil religion, thinking of civil religion as public expression that links the nation to God. This morning, I would like to talk about developments in civil religion and the nation roughly since the 1960s up to the present and where we are now. And then some ways that we as Christians, some thoughts about ways that we as Christians might be able to engage others and engage our society with these in mind. Kind of maybe some takeaways I have, and then I'd like to hear from you if you have takeaways. Keeping in mind that, I think there's some dangers to civil religion that it can merge or conflate the kingdom of God and the kingdom of earth or the nation as being the same thing when they are not, could turn into a form of idolatry where the nation becomes the object of ultimate allegiance. It can also, certain forms can crowd out certain kinds of distinctive religious beliefs. At the same time, though, civil religion, and I think the way the framers of the Constitution thought about it, can unite people under a common, people of different religious convictions under sort of common principles. And it does draw attention to questions of what are some sort of higher truths, transcendent truths, if you will. And I spent some time last week on the 1950s, not because I think that's a golden age, but I think because it demonstrates one way that some of these e pluribus unum features came out, as a lot of people were trying to build consensus and unite the country in a number of ways. And then there was some problems with that. And the problems within civil religion in the 1950s came out, and here's the short historical explanation. It fell apart in the 1960s and 70s. The consensus, the united things got divisive, and for a lot of different reasons, which we won't go into here. And the result is that as things played out in the 60s and 70s, and that consensus of what America was and trying to unite around some higher ideals broke down, you ended up beginning in the 1980s and up to the present, and in a very intense way, with the culture wars, which you can read as a number of different ways, but one thing that is going is you've got kind of two different visions of what American society should be on a cultural level that then get battled out in public. And so I want to talk a bit about that. And I'm drawing from a book. If I had my PowerPoint, I'd have a cover up here of it, by George Marsden, called The Twilight of the American Enlightenment, where he talks about this process of the 1950s and how basically how academics and public intellectuals and leaders were trying to form a consensus, and why that didn't hold together and why it broke down. And he makes an interesting point in regards to religion, because he says this leads to the culture wars, as I mentioned. I think a lot of people understand that. That's how a lot of historians talk about it. But he makes this point. He said that in the culture wars, we have these two sides. Neither one handles religious diversity very well, but for different reasons. On the right, religious conservatives, they can find some common ground with some religious groups, but don't have a good way of uniting or finding common ground with secular groups or non-Christian groups, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then on the left, and I think these are groups within the right and the left. I think there are exceptions, but there are groups within. On the left, you have some secular liberals, and this may seem like an odd point, that they don't handle diversity well, because diversity is, of course, such an important idea among people on the left. How can that be a problem? And the left has very well developed principles for thinking about racial diversity and ethnic diversity and gender and a number of other things, but do not have a good sort of way of finding common ground with diverse religious perspectives. What about religious diversity, in other words? And oftentimes when we hear about that word diversity today, it's rarely used with a real robust religious diversity. We immediately go to race, of course, and maybe some other things. So let me talk about that just a little bit. First, on the religious right, many people, not everybody, but many people on the religious right promote a view that implicitly and sometimes explicitly wants America to return to a Christian nation, and they imagine that the United States was a Christian nation. I think what they're really doing is wanting to return to civil religion, because the United States was never really exactly the Christian nation that some people imagined it to be, for a number of reasons. But for 200 years, what has been true is that there have been some Christians who've thought of the United States as a Christian nation, even though there are, it's actually more complicated. It's actually more complicated than that, just to say it's a straight Christian nation. Because from the very beginning, just to give you one example, some of the most important leaders, Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, were not Orthodox Christians, just to give one example. And of course, we've talked about the First Amendment. You cannot have an establishment of religion and so forth. But for some on the religious right, there's a sense that the only real way to relate religion and public life is to have basically a form of Christianity calling the shots or dominating. There are some that are that way. Not everybody on the religious right is that way, but there's a tendency or a pull on that. And so I think there are today in the culture wars some people on the religious right who think that the only choice is between sort of Christians leading or maybe dominating and secularism. That's the only choice you have. And so with that, they'll support Christians leading the way. And I think there's a lot of people who just don't think these things through, or have a basic idea. Oh yeah, Christian nation, sure. And then that's as far as they go with this. The secular left, this is maybe a bit more difficult to see, but let me explain a little bit about what has happened on the secular left and some underlying sort of beliefs or assumptions that come out of academics in higher education. In the late 19th and early 20th century, there were forces in education that sort of developed higher education, college, a model for scholarship and learning and engaging society that would push religion to the side. That religion was okay as an individual private thing, but when you enter the laboratory or the classroom or the study, you were supposed to leave your religion outside. Check your religion at the door, leave it in the hallway. And then you come in and you take on the mode of the thought is the images of an unbiased scientist, where you're going to look at things, you take this neutral position and you just look at facts and forces and laws, and you you test them out. Along with that, there was a growing belief among many that when you look at the development of human societies, in particular religion, down through history, for centuries and centuries and centuries, religion, morals, ethics, that these did not reflect some universal transcendent truth established by God or the gods or a force or something like that. But these are all created by human societies. Today, the word is they're all social constructions. That's a phrase that is often used, that human beings create, and so the Chinese with Confucianism have one way, and in the Middle East, Muslims have another way, and the Jews developed, and those were all just human beings in particular situations responding and creating things. And so you're eliminating a sense that there's that religion and morals come from some overriding transcendent truth that's built into the cosmos, and it's just what we come up with in a pragmatic way to kind of deal with society. And this gets more and more currency in the 20th century in certain areas of higher education. Not so much, although maybe today on the ground among non-academics, but certainly among academics. So when we got to the 1950s, there were leaders, public leaders, who believed in ideals of America: equality, freedom, liberty, justice, tolerance. And of course, these are tied to moral and ethical issues and religious issues. So how do you reconcile that with, if these are sort of, number one, socially constructed, and also number two, we're just kind of stepping back and looking at this in a neutral way. But they did think that these were very important for America, to hold America together and to unite America. And so they kind of followed in the footsteps of the framers in saying these are important principles for America, and believed they were following, except for one important thing. And that is, even if John Adams and Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson were not Orthodox Christians, they did still believe that they were deriving laws that were built into the universe, that it was like from God. They did believe in a God, and that God established these laws. But in the 1950s, they're like, no, we believe in equality and liberty, but they don't really come from God. They are things that we have come up with because we've realized this is the best way to run society. And so how do you hold that together? Generally, what a lot of these academics said, well, what's happened in the United States down through its histories, there's kind of been a Protestant establishment that has held all that together, and that's a good thing. And they uphold useful myths, in the name, as one historian called it. So they don't really necessarily believe in some of them did not believe in this God. Some of them said, yeah, there is a God, but okay, it's still a lot of these things we produce are just sort of what we come up with as a pragmatic good idea. But that's you're on different ground now than the founders of the Constitution were in. And so in the 50s, the thought was broad-minded Protestants. That's kind of the model we will use, and it will include everybody. And yeah, this is the Judeo-Christian sort of tradition. We'll be able to incorporate broad-minded Catholics and broad-minded Jews and so forth. And so in that way, religion is good. And even if we ourselves don't believe it, we might or we might not, but religion is good in that way for sort of uniting all of society. And so civil religion is a fine thing. And then that kind of reflects Dwight Eisenhower's phrase, right? The American democratic system is built on religion, and I don't care what religion it is. It's just these basic principles that we agree to. By the way, it could accommodate Catholics and Jews, but there was no thought about really serious thought about Muslims and Hindus or Buddhists or other world religions, because the thought was these are, in the 50s, it was thought the era of immigration is over. We had strict immigration rules at that time. That didn't change till 1965. And so this is what we have in America, basically. We are not going to be a nation of all these other religious groups, so we don't have to worry about them. But here's where, okay, so here's where kind of the foundation on the secular left, here's where the tensions come in. You can hold to this broad-minded religion as long as you don't hold too lightly or tightly to like transcendent truths, because that's where you're going to run into disagreement with somebody else and it'll break down the consensus. And so religious groups that argue too loudly that their particular way, they have some truth and they believe other people are wrong, that's not good. And the term is, they're sectarian. So in other words, fundamentalists and Pentecostals, Orthodox Jews, Mormons, those groups don't really quite fit because they're bringing too many distinctive ideas into the public sphere. And so the paradox here in the 1950s is that a lot of these leaders believed that Judeo-Christian religion could unite the country under common ethics, and so that's why they supported civil religion, while simultaneously believing the way to do that is to leave traditional religion behind. So it's a religion, but it has to be a new religion, but the traditional religions don't fit. And this is where you start to have a religious diversity problem on the left. And at the time, it was thought that was okay because the theories of secularization were that these groups are going to fade away anyway. They're not going to survive because with more education and development, America will secularize and that'll take care of it. In fact, just to give you one example, a encyclopedia entry for fundamentalism in the 1930s described the entire thing in the past tense. You know, it's done. That was something that came up and ended with the Scopes trial in 1925, and now they're just not going to be around anymore. And there's a few people in the hills of Tennessee who still believe it, but eventually, you know, they'll come around. All right. Then the 60s and 70s hit, and a lot of things erode the vision, especially for academics on the left, and a lot of things that academics themselves shift on. The youth movement rebelled against the establishment, which also meant rebelling against consensus. I don't know where you were in the 60s, but you know, you don't trust anybody over 30, and you know, the establishment, government, and the military and higher education and business and media, that there's a strong impulse that all of that is suspect. And so a lot of things tied to consensus and civil religion go out. The United States becomes more diverse in a lot of different ways in the 60s and 70s. And then on top of that, at the same time, traditional religions not only did not die out, many of them grew and became stronger, if you will, which surprised a lot of people who thought that, well, we're getting more secular. Right, when Jimmy Carter ran for president in 1976 and said he was an evangelical, there were a lot of newspaper media people who had to scurry around and say, what is an evangelical? What is this? And how can, you know, and they find, how can a person be an evangelical today? And so the problem on the left then was how to deal with these religious groups that held to traditional doctrines, and especially if they were going to try to bring them into public. And some of these religious groups were evangelistic, right? Evangelicals, fundamentalists, Pentecostals, and that involves a public dimension. If you're going to evangelize, I mean, it may not come out in government, but it'll come out somewhere where you're going to be bringing your religious faith out. And that didn't fit under this model. And so we have the culture wars. And I think that part of what happens with the culture wars today is that we're given a false dichotomy. Two options and only two. Option A, either you have Christianity dominating, which is fine with some on the right and scares a lot of people on the left, or B, where you have sort of a secularism dominating, which is fine with many on the left, but scares a lot of people on the right. And as my colleague says, when faced with a choice between option A and option B, what do? You look for option C. And what is option C? And there are a number of people who've put forth option C. George Marsden in his book says, and there are other people who are arguing for this, we need to try to figure out some sort of what he calls confessional pluralism, where you're allowing diversity, but you're allowing diversity that recognizes there are different groups and bodies that have perspectives that you have to allow in the public sphere, and I won't get into that now. But just to say there is an option C, because I don't know exactly how to work that out, but I think it's certainly worth exploring. But I had a new thought. Then I had another thought this week about civil religion, new for me at least. It was sparked by a conversation I had with Mark Snavely during a break in our choir rehearsal on Thursday night, and we were talking about civil religion. And I learned from him something. I learned there's this relatively new development, as he described it, in area high school basketball games, that when they do the national anthem, a lot of schools now have purchased this great, a fairly large mechanism that when you get to the national anthem, it'll lower this big flag. Are you aware of this? How many of you are aware of this? Okay, one. All right. A lot of us are out of touch also. But so apparently there are a lot of schools around that are doing this. So you sing the national anthem and this big flag rolls down. It's through a mechanized thing up there, and it's just like right there. It's big. And I thought, whoa, that seems pretty dramatic and striking example of civil religion. You're going to have that, the flag is going to be there, but it's going to be big and it's going to be unavoidable right in front of you. And then I wondered this. I wonder how many high schools in New Haven, Connecticut, or Portland, Oregon do this. And I don't know. Maybe a lot of them do. But I'm guessing that this is more common in red state areas than it is in blue state areas. Because I think there are other indications of this sort of thing or not. And I'd love to see, maybe somebody has, but I'd love to see, a good sociologist of religion do a study on different ways that civil religion works its way out, like this in red state versus blue state kind of areas, the actual practices and ceremonies of civil religion. And my thought was that civil religion itself now has taken a new form, and it's a new form where it's migrated to one side of the culture wars, and the other side, or let me put it this way, that that civil religion has become a key part, a certain kind of civil religion has become a key part of the identity on the right, and a downplaying or aversion to civil religion has become a key identity to some people on the left. Yeah.
Flag coming down for the national anthem. How does that translate to you as an instance of civil religion? I guess I'm not seeing that.
Oh, okay. I'm just thinking that it is just by its very size and prominence, it's making a very strong statement. I mean, I think it's making a strong statement about patriotism, but it is a ceremony. It is a ritual if you go back to thinking about that. And so there's almost like what I see is a strong statement about that. Now on the left, I don't, does that answer that question? Yeah. Yeah. Well, if we go back to Robert Bella's definition of civil religion, he said civil religion has to have symbols and rituals and ceremonies, and that is really the stuff that religion is made out of. And so it's maybe accompanies, Robert Bella would say, accompanies Christianity or other religions, but there's a religious dimension to it, a certain sort of sacredness, a certain sort of, deep respect and a sense to a higher sort of, truth, or a higher sort of devotion that is also tied to the nation in some way. And it's a bolder statement. Now, my thought then was on the left, in thinking about this, about a month or two ago, Elise and I watched a movie called Leave the World Behind. And it's a kind of an apocalyptic movie. And I won't tell you exactly what happens because, that really ruins things. But I just want to say one part of it. The actor Kevin Bacon plays a character in this movie, and he's a survivalist. He is stocking up on water and guns to protect his home, and seems to be into thinking about conspiracy theories, and he distrusts the government and believes these sort of things. He's clearly a type. And there's a scene in the movie when two characters come to his home, and he comes out onto the porch with his shotgun, and there's an American flag flying right there. And this is the one part where I did want the PowerPoint image, because I have an image of that from the movie, and it struck me that the people who are making this movie are using the Kevin Bacon character as a type, a little bit kind of crazy, guns and gods and guts kind of guy on the right, but there's the flag, a symbol, I think almost of civil religion, and the people in the movie that's those people. And so, my thought is, my interpretation on that is that, well, that's an example where an excessive patriotism is part of the identity. And I think the other thing that's happening is, in the culture wars on the right, around civil religion, you're uniting people on the right, but they're not all necessarily religious. There's a lot of, and it's kind of how civil religion works, that there's some evidence that a lot of people on the right are deeply religious or somewhat religious, but there's some that are not religious at all. And polls are showing that church attendance has been dropping, and as what some people would expect, it's maybe dropping on the left because the left is seen as more secular. But church attendance among Republicans has been dropping since 2016. Before, it's been dropping since time before the pandemic. That's one thing. But polls also show, and this I find really fascinating, that people who identify as evangelical, we're now starting to find, number one, people who identify as evangelical also report that they don't go to church. Which, if you come from evangelical circles like I did from back in the day, like if you're an evangelical, that you're a sore thumb. And part of being a sore thumb is you go to church regularly and other people are like, oh yeah, you're one of those crazy religious people. Sometimes you got that feeling. But now you have people who don't go to church regularly who identify themselves as evangelical, number one. But also, this is the real kicker, you're starting to see people identify as evangelical who also are identifying as Catholic or Mormon or Muslim or Hindu. Not that Muslims and Hindus all identify as evangelical, but there are people out there who are doing that because evangelical has become a political term, right? And so that is, some people look at evangelical and they're looking at how it's reported in the media and they're like, yes, I mean, I'm patriotic and I'm conservative and I believe God ought to be involved in things. And so sure, I'm an evangelical. So so there are some, and there are a lot of evangelicals, of course, that are very deeply committed, sincere religious people, but things are shifting in a way where, I attribute, and I don't know, we just need more study on this. I attribute this to a type of civil religion. So on the right, you're uniting people in certain ways, but there's a weakness in terms of religious diversity because there are certain religious groups, like for instance, atheists and agnostics or non-Christians who maybe don't fit into that, although things are shifting all the time. And on the left, maybe an aversion to civil religion and too much patriotism is identified with the right, and so you are identifying against these people. We're different, and you can unite a lot of people on the left, but you're not, you've got the religious diversity problem in that it's going to be very hard to incorporate some religious groups, as I mentioned, like Pentecostals or fundamentalists, or maybe Orthodox Jews or conservative Catholics into that group also. So anyway, I hesitate to say too much more, and I may be off on my analysis on this because I think, like a historian, and that means we need to wait 30 or 40 years to figure out just what's going on. Because it's so hard to see when you're right in the midst of it. But these are some ideas I have. All right, but I do want to get to this. I want to say one more thing about recent polls, and this is maybe a transition into what we're going to do in terms of how we should engage things. A recent poll, this is just from last month in January, asked Democrats what percentage of Democrats say Republicans are immoral. 63% of Democrats said Republicans are immoral. In 2016, that number was immoral. Immoral. Did I say moral? Sorry. Thank you. Yes, you were tracking and you caught that. Okay. Yeah, 63% Democrats say Republicans are immoral. This is also where it would be good to have this up here. That was only 35% in 2016. So it's gone from 35 up to 67%. On the other side, Republicans who say Democrats are immoral, 72%. And that's up from 47% in 2016. So part of the culture wars, and this is why I say in some ways it's connected to some sort of, well, it's connected to religious, at least religious sensibilities or dimensions. Because if you're talking about morality, that's usually tied into some sort of sense of some sort of, where does morality come from? Some sort of religious sensibility. Also, Americans who say they would be displeased if their child married somebody from another party is now at 40%. That's up from 1960, it was 4%. So we did have a lot more consensus in the 50s that, okay, I'm a Republican, you're a Democrat, but of course you could marry somebody from another political party. All right, so what do we do about this? I've got a few thoughts, you may have some more, but my first thought is we first of all need to start with ourselves. And here's one place to start, because I think it's not just simply having particular beliefs or particular ideas, although I'm in favor of clear thinking and discernment. I'm pro-discernment. But in recent decades, social psychologists have done a lot of really great work in uncovering and detailing all sorts of unconscious biases that we have. And you've probably heard a number of these things, but they've got more than 110 different kinds of unconscious biases that we have. And I just want to talk about one, in-group and out-group bias. So a basic definition of this, we can't help but put ourselves into groups or think of ourselves in groups. In-group members have positive views of each other, people in your group, and give each other preferential treatment. But the out-group is anybody that does not belong to your group, and they are viewed more negatively and receive inferior treatment in comparison to the people in your group. It's, basics. This is pervasive, and as I mentioned, it's also unconscious, and there's all kinds of studies. Of course, it's been very helpful in thinking about racial attitudes, because we're finding a lot of racial attitudes are unconscious or preconscious even. They've done studies that show our brains, when you see a face, we make a judgment about how honest that person is before we even consciously think about what we're looking at, like in a millisecond. Something is buried deep down within us. And if you think about, bias and in-group and out-group bias, you can see how that comes out in a lot of different ways, and you can see it probably coming. I mean, I know as a Notre Dame football fan, I observe Ohio State and Michigan football fans, and my thought is, oh yeah, a lot of people around here have that bias. Yeah, okay. More on that in a minute. No. Bias we'll freely admit to, or yeah, okay. But obviously this is going to be at work in a lot of other areas too. Political parties, what political party we identify with, and in a whole important thing. But the important point here, I think, is that this is unconscious. We're not aware of it. We don't recognize it. And becoming aware of it by itself does not solve the problem. We think it might solve the problem. Oh, yes, I'm guilty of, but studies actually show that oftentimes people become aware of a bias, and then they get worse because they think they've conquered the bias, because they become aware of it. And if you think about human nature, how human nature works, if we have, and I'm going to link a lot of these biases to a certain sort of sin, or even a vice, the vice of vainglory, putting myself, above other people. Like that is it's just something that we are conscious of. We don't take care of a sin by saying, oh yes, well, I'm just going to stop doing that now. It just doesn't work like that. And then the insidious thing is that we can be biased when we're about the things that we really trying hard to be good at. Because then we can form an in-group bias of I and all these people are trying really, really hard to be good at this. And the problem with those groups, or here's my favorite anecdote to explain this. I can't remember if I gave this before, but I just love this anecdote. I was talking to a historian once, and another historian, he was from about this, and he was from Maine, and he attended a Quaker, a Friends meeting or church in Maine, and he said one day after church, after the meeting, he was walking out, and he heard two women talking behind him to one another, and one of them said, well, I'm sure glad that we Friends don't stereotype people like those Southern Baptists do. Right. So, part of the problem is, who you're going to be to cast the first stone. And sometimes Notre Dame fans are the first to cast the first stone, and it's unconscious, and you're not even aware that you're doing these things. And so, I think this is important, really, when you think about it. If you fall into any particular kinds of groups, if you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent, or you favor civil religion, or you don't favor civil religion, or you're Christian, you're Jewish, you're atheist, or your highest level of education is is high school, your highest level of education is a PhD, or you happen to be a human being. If you fall into any of those groups, you are susceptible to in-group, out-group bias. So what do we do with that? So my first thought is we have biblical resources and biblical reflection and study that can help us. When Paul wrote the book of Romans, he was not only laying out all this really complex, very important theology, but he had a pastoral concern. He was writing to the church in Rome, and the church in Rome had a problem. And the problem was they had division between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. And Jewish Christians were thinking that, if you really are going to follow the Messiah, you do need to follow the law. And that means these rules about, food and circumcision and all that sort of stuff. And Gentile Christians were saying, no, we don't need to do that. And so what do you get? You get the verse where he says, where one group is judging the other, the Jewish Christians, and the Gentile Christians are resenting this judgment, and you're dividing into in-group, out-group biases there. And so Paul says, why do you pass judgment on your brother or sister? I think he has in mind Jewish Christians there. And then he says, or you, why do you despise your brother or sister? And he has Gentile Christians there. So this is right, in the idea. And one suggestion I read a book, I got this, a great book by Scott McKnight, Reading Romans Backwards, by Scott McKnight, where he talks about really this underlying pastoral issue in the church that Paul is talking about. And I thought, boy, to read Romans and think, how am I like the Jewish Christians? Or how am I like the Gentile Christians? And read it that way can, I think, be a very helpful way of more deeply understanding these unconscious biases. But there's also this, Psalm 19. It's this wonderful passage in Psalm 19. I mean, the psalmist gets into the part where he talks about the law. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul, and the testimonies of the Lord are sure, and the ordinances of the Lord, and the precepts, and so forth. And then he said, this is wonderful. They're to be more desired than gold. And then all of a sudden he switches, and the psalmist says, but who can discern his errors? In some translations, who can detect his own errors? Clear me from hidden faults. Keep back your servant also from proud thoughts. That's one translation. Do not let them have dominion over me. The psalmist recognizes that I have unconsciously these proud thoughts or these errors that I don't recognize. And so there's a spiritual discipleship discipline there that we should undergo. And I think that confessing, right? Psalm 19 is talking about confessing sins. That's what he is doing. Clear me from hidden faults is a very important thing that we can do. And we should not only confess our conscious sins, but confess unconscious sins, if that makes sense. Unconscious biases that we might have that might lead us to favor one group over another. And I think this works when one of the wonderful things about our service, right, is that we have that prayer of confession that we go through every week. And it's different every week. Some of those are really wonderful prayers, those prayers of confession. Can we pray this in a way that we can think about our conscious sin and our unconscious sins? And so it works with this morning's prayer of confession, where it says, God of glory, beauty, and grace, we have tried to hide from you, to hide our faces, to hide our sin. And one way of hiding our face from God is refusing to face things that are maybe deep down inside of us, or things that might be unconscious, or that first glimmer of when an unconscious sin starts to pop up to the surface. Do we face it or allow it to come out and confess it, or we push it back down and hide it from ourselves just like we're hiding it from God in some ways? We'll have an opportunity in just a few minutes. We will pray that prayer. Unless you went to the early service, then you already prayed it, and you're out of luck. Sorry, too bad. You can have to wait for the lectionary to come around another 4 years, and maybe this prayer. No. You can go back and pray it again, of course. But I think any prayer of confession, can we approach it with a way of, yeah, and what about the things that are buried deep and so deep inside of me that I'm not conscious of them? And that includes an in-group and out-group bias. And as we're engaging others in our society today, we need to recognize that about ourselves, I think, or be aware that those sort of things are at work. Then I think my second thought, and it was prompted by the comment a couple of weeks ago, by Michael Opart on this, that finding common ground with others, I think it's possible to find common ground, maybe not with every individual, but at least with just about all groups in the United States. I mean, I think just about all Americans do think that freedom is a good thing. And there's a theological basis for finding common ground, even with non-believers, and it's a good doctrine that Presbyterians believe in, common grace. Common grace, right, is the idea that God gives abilities and gifts to all people, regardless of whether they know him or not. And it can be everything from the ability to, he teaches farmers how to grow things. There's a passage in Isaiah on that, but I think, this athletic gifts. But also all people have a moral sensibility to them. And of course, we violate it oftentimes, but nevertheless, all people have some sort of moral sensibility to it. That's common grace, different from saving grace, justifying grace, sanctifying grace, and that sort of thing. But that provides a basis for common ground with all people, including people who are not believers, including atheists or agnostics. Okay, we disagree on where this comes from, but can't we agree on some of these basic principles and start with common ground with others? This is maybe a principle for Thanksgiving, where you've got crazy Uncle Larry who has kind of wild opinions, and you're not supposed to talk about religion or politics at Thanksgiving. So if you're doing civil religion, you've got both of them all in one package. It's very explosive. Okay, I'm going to come back to the Thanksgiving thing, but one of them is that maybe finding some common ground. I want to give you, I have another example, but I'm going to move on because I want to give you a chance I want to hear what you have to say. So my third point is that if you can get yourself on common ground, then we may also need to have difficult conversations. And this is what I am not good at, is having difficult conversations. I would rather just avoid. And this can happen with crazy Uncle Larry at Thanksgiving, right? Let's just not talk about it. And sometimes it's not good to talk about everything. And sometimes just to keep a ceasefire in place, no, let's avoid that. But a ceasefire does not heal anything. It only pauses things. And if you're really going to build peace and heal things, there's some point at which, okay, we got to talk about things. And this requires discernment. It's very difficult. But sometimes we have to have those difficult conversations with people, and we have to get to discernment. Are we in a position? Do we have a good enough relationship with this person that I can bring this conversation up? Have we gotten to that part? You you don't. Sorry, I was thinking of my dad, who just a happy Methodist minister and is happy to talk about all things. We're at a big family reunion. He met my cousin had married somebody, and he sat down at the table with her, and his opening comment was, "So, what do you think of Trump?" Okay, Dad, no. Maybe you don't lead with that, it's maybe get there if you want to. But anyway, and then I think, fourthly, we shouldn't worry so much about trying to win arguments. And this is another one where I got to work on this. There's times when I just get in those modes where I just feel like I want to win arguments. Sometimes when I'm teaching with my students, I'm just into winning arguments. For this reason, If you're going to, the people's hearts and minds will be changed by God, not by us. We have a role in that. But our role is not to get people to think about what is good and right. Our role is to, I would say, as a historian, a good historian, I read, a Christian historian says, you work not for ammunition, but for illumination. So much we're trying to get the ammunition to prove ourselves right with somebody else. Let's listen to them. Let's find out about them. A comment Sue made, I think, a couple of weeks ago. Can we listen to others? Can we have a ground where we're going to be able to first find out about other people, and then work from there? Because I don't know. I don't know what's ahead, but it's an election year. This could be a really bumpy road ahead, especially when we've got 2/3 of the country that just does not trust others, the other half, that are not in their party, and thinks that they're immoral. I think more so than the specific policy issues, maybe now is a time to think about how do we build some common ground and some peace in some ways. Just a thought on that. Okay, how about your thoughts of maybe of things to, yeah, Fred.
Telling my age a little bit,